Hi, my name is John, and today we're in the cockpit of the Mi-24P, which has been released for DCS World quite recently. In this video I wanted to give you a small tour of the cockpit, including the most important gauges and buttons and switches, and then I also wanted to show you how to start up the helicopter and take it into the air. So we're starting our cockpit tour here in the back in the seat number 1, the pilot seat or commander seat. And we will only show this part of the cockpit in this video because there's a lot of information already and I don't want to make this video too long. So let's get started. Okay, starting at the very top, we have our head-up display here, which is used during attacks. Obviously, it doesn't show any flight information like airspeed or anything like that. That's all down here. Moving further down, I'll zoom in a bit. Here is our lights for the weapons. It shows which weapon is selected. Then coming to the left, we have some more sight instruments. There's a lot of options here. We will not go through them in this video. Then coming to the very left here, we have our G meter, which shows the current G load. We have our warning and annunciator panel. Then we have our vertical gyro control for the artificial horizon 1 and 2. We have our drift indicator, which shows our helicopter relative speed over the ground in low speed. So it basically helps you hover at a higher altitude. Then we have our forward speed in kilometers per hour. The maximum you should not exceed is 320 kilometers per hour during normal flight. Then we have in the middle here our artificial horizon with obviously the horizon in the middle and the slip indicator on the bottom. It also has the instruments for the precision approach the helicopter can do. Then we have our climb and descent rate in meters per second, pretty self-explanatory. Then coming up here we have our main clock, mechanical wind up, which is quite cool. Then we have our radar warning receiver. Moving down we have our moving map, and in this case it's actually just a moving map. There is a piece of paper and then there is a bar that moves over that piece of paper. So it's not computerized or anything like that. It's really just a mechanical map holder with a indicator. And it has two different zoom levels you can switch between. And in the real world, obviously you would have to adjust the switch here, and then you would also have to change the paper to the right zoom level. And to the left of that we have our backup attitude indicator, our horizontal situation indicator with our navigation needles, then the altimeter, which shows the altitude in meters above sea level or whatever you set it to. Then we have our radio altimeter, which shows you the altitude above ground below the helicopter in meters. And to the left of that we have our blade pitch indicator. It shows the blade pitch between 1 and 15 degrees. Now moving down we have our main rotor speed indicator. You should normally stay within the yellow range during normal operation, and the nominal RPM is 93%. Then we have our engine RPM indicator. Usually in flight it's about 80 to 100% depending on your current power need. Then you have the power indicator, I like to call it, or torque indicator, and it basically shows you on the left and right the torque your engine is producing, and in the middle you have the 3 red marks which move and show you the different limits. The uppermost limit is takeoff power, which you're allowed to use for 6 minutes. Then you have the nominal power, which you can use 60 minutes, and then below that you have cruise power, which you can use continuously. To the right of that we have our exhaust gas temperature indicator, our drift angle, again that's related to this instrument. It shows you your ground track. So for example, if you have a strong wind from the right hand side and you're flying straight ahead, this will show you that you're actually drifting to the left. And it also shows you your ground speed in kilometers per hour. Then we have the fuel gauge, which is quite complicated. We will talk about that once the helicopter is powered up, because it has several settings related to the different fuel tanks. And then down here we have the left and right engine oil pressure and temperature, our main gearbox oil pressure, and our drivetrain oil pressure and temperature. And then further down here we have some more navigation related stuff, sling load controls, a lot of stuff like that. To the right down here we have our ammunition counter. It's the left middle station, left inner station, the helicopter's main gun, the right inner station and the right outer station. It basically shows you how many rounds is left. And you can see currently we don't have any gun pods mounted, but we have the internal ammunition, which is 125 rounds. Then we have over here the DC power panel, the AC power panel, the voltage indicators for DC and AC. Then we have our air conditioning and ice protection up here. And on the back wall we have a lot of circuit breakers and further systems. Moving over to the left hand side, again a lot of circuit breakers in the back, lights, flight recorder, warning system controls up here. Then we have our radio navigation power switches in the next row. Then we have our signal flares, like most Russian helicopters. The Mi-24 has 8 signal flares in different colors. Then we have some radios and further systems. Down here we have the APU and engine start controls, which we will use just in a bit. We have more radio systems, which you might be already familiar with. And then we have more switches related to the cockpit and the fuel system. Moving further forward, we have the fire warning and extinguisher system. And then we have some more lights, some more pressures and temperatures for the hydraulics. Our gear selector, which should actually be down. I'm not sure why that was up right now. And then moving further, down here we have our autopilot controls. And last but not least, down here in the middle, our weapon controls for the pilot's operated weapons. And there are some more controls up front, which I will take a look at a later point. Okay, let's get the helicopter started. In the beginning, we will turn on the DC power battery right and left. And we also turn on the power from battery switch, which allows us to start the systems from the battery. Then we need to pull this lever here to turn on all the circuit breakers on the back here. And we can do the same thing on the left hand side. Turning the lever turns on all the circuit breakers simultaneously. And you can also hear the automated voice warning system going through its self-test. And after that is done, we can turn on the service tank pumps 1 and 2. We can turn on the fuel shut-off valves for the left and right engine. We will turn on the crossfeed. And then we do not need to turn on the external tank switch here, because we do not have any external tanks mounted. If you had, you would turn that on as well. And when we turn on the tank transfer pumps. And next, on the fire warning panel here, I will turn on the fire extinguishing and warning system. And then we can start up the APU by going to the APU start panel down here and hitting the APU start button for a second or two. And you should be able to see the EGT temperature rise quite quickly. And while the APU is spooling up, which does not require our direct attention, we can close the cockpit door. And then we will pressurize the rubber seal by pulling this lever here, or knob here, to the back. And this blows up a rubber seal inside the door to make the cockpit airtight. Now, after the APU has started, which you can see by the APU RPM nominal light down here, we can continue with the engine start procedure. But before doing that, we will have to disable the rotor brake by lowering the brake lever down here. Now we come back to the APU start panel, and it also allows us to start the engines, and we will start with the engine that is facing the wind. So today the wind is coming from the left hand side, so we will start the left hand engine first by selecting left on the engine start selector here, and then hitting the start button. And we will also turn on shortly afterwards the left hand fuel cutoff. And as you can see in the front here on the engine RPM gauge, the number 1 engine, which is the left one, is slowly increasing its speed. And you can also see the main rotor begins to spin. And now that takes a couple of seconds until the first engine is up to its idle speed, which is about 75% RPM. And once it reaches that, we can begin starting the second engine. And it's not allowed to start both engines simultaneously, because that would overpower the APU. But the starting procedure is quick enough anyway, I would say. so we don't really need to worry about that too much. Okay, now the lights are out. We can start the right-hand engine by selecting the right-hand engine, hitting the start button again, and turning on the fuel cutoff to the right-hand engine. And again, we see the engine RPM increasing. Number 2 is the right-hand engine, and it's at 20% now, and it should quickly spool up further. While it's doing that, we can go ahead. The next things we need to do once we have reached idle RPM is turn on the electrical power. But it's important to turn up your throttle before that, so don't pull on your collective, but turn up the engine throttle before that, because the generator can only work if the rotor is above 80 to 85% rotor speed. So both engines are idle now, and we can slowly turn up the throttle, which in turn increases the main rotor speed to its idle RPM value, its flight value of 93%. Okay, once it reaches 93%, we can go to the electrical panel here, and we can see the red generator lights are illuminated, and we can turn on the right hand and left hand generator. Then we can also turn on the 115 main transformer and the 36 volt main transformer by turning on those two switches. And then we will turn on the left and right rectifier, and we can disable the power from battery switch again because we don't need it anymore. And also we have the APU on light here, which reminds you to turn off the APU on the left hand side. So once that is done, we can continue further left, and we will turn on the intercom system, the radios, the radio altimeter, the Doppler navigation system, the gyro 1 and 2, the compensator system, the radar warning receiver, the IFF system, and the blinker. And the blinker is basically just blinking the warning and annunciator lights so they are more apparent. Next important thing we need to turn on is the fan. Obviously, all Russian helicopters need to have the fan spinning, else they cannot fly. Okay, continuing further forward, the next thing I would like to turn on is the SPU 152, which is a rudder ratio limiter and adjustable end stops. It basically prevents over-torquing of the rudder mechanism, and I also like to turn on the autopilot pitch and roll channel. And note, if you can't reach any of the buttons because you cannot move your head around, you can press backspace on the keyboard to remove the seat and the stick, which makes it easier for the hard to reach buttons to press them. Okay, after we have done that, we come up here and we can see the red lights blinking, and those remind us that the attitude indicators and gyros need to be caged, and they stop blinking and the red warning flags on the attitude indicator 1 and 2 disappeared. Now the last things we need to do, we need to turn on the air conditioning system so the cockpit is cool, and on the other side we need to sync our navigation system by pressing the sync button shortly. And you can also turn on the radios depending on what you need, as well as the navigation systems like the ADF and other navigation systems like the landing system, but we don't need that for the flight today, so we will skip that. And yeah, now we have turned on most of the things we need. The last thing I like to turn on is the head-up display, or the indicator here. So we just have the crosshair on the head-up display, and I just like to have that for taking off. And if it's a dusty day, we can also turn on our dust filter by flicking this switch forward here, which will filter out the dusts from our engine intakes, which makes them live longer. Probably not necessary on this airport, but for example in the desert, that would be very necessary. After we have prepared everything, we can continue with our takeoff procedure. Now the last thing to do before actually departing the airfield is to do a hover check, where we'll use a low altitude hover to check our engines, instruments, pressures, everything the like. So just to make sure that our helicopter is working fine and we don't get any nasty surprises during the takeoff run. So for that we will bring the helicopter into a hover about 3 to 4 meters above the ground, and we will get right into it. First I will release the parking brake by pressing W, and then we can see the helicopter is already moving a bit, and we use our cyclic to stop the movement and slowly increase the collective. And with the rudder pedals we will correct for any yawing tendencies. And I will make sure that our helicopter is not too wobbly. I'm not very experienced in the Mi-24 yet, so my hover is not perfect, unfortunately. Okay, so let's get into a low altitude hover here. We'll check our main instruments. For the rotor speed, it should be 93%. The engines should be in a good torque range, which they are. Temperatures are looking good and pressures are looking good. So our hover check is successful, and we can use the fact that we are a helicopter to cut down our taxi time by using a small hover over the grass here. And then the wind was coming from the left beforehand, so I will turn into the wind once we reach the runway. And as we're already moving at a bit of speed, we will continue with a running takeoff in ground effect, which basically means we will not have the wheels on the ground. We will just use our collective setting, increase it slightly, and keep the nose pointing a bit downwards until we pick up sufficient speed, which is about 70 to 100 kilometers per hour. And then we will start a slight climb away from the ground. Once we have reached sufficient altitude, the gear can come up, and we will continue our climb. Don't forget to use the trimmer to keep the helicopter leveled. And then we can also turn off the dust filter again, because once we're in the air, dust is no longer that big of a factor. At least not if there's not a dust storm, obviously. And now we're in a nice climb at 170 kilometers per hour. Cruising speed is around 250. For climbs I like to use about between 150 and 200 kilometers per hour, which gives a nice climb rate. And we also occasionally check our power gauge here, so that we are staying below or at the cruise power setting to not over torque our engines. And then we can reduce power just a bit and continue on a nice straight out climb here. And the last thing we talked about in the introduction video was the fuel gauge, which I have not explained yet, so I'll get right into it. Now basically the fuel gauge down here has a couple of settings for the different tanks, and in the normal total mode the outermost scale is the one that is correct. So if you're in total mode, use the outer scale, and we can see we have about 900 liters of fuel aboard. For tanks 1 and 2, which are the feeder tanks for the engine, we will use the middle scale, which is called service, and we can see both of them have about 350 liters of fuel in them, which means they are full, because all the other tanks pump their fuel into those service tanks. Now tank number 3 is probably already empty. It uses the inner scale, and tanks 4 and 5 also use the inner scale. And you can see the combined value of 4 and 5 is about 180 liters. So they are turning empty or running empty soon as well. And then if we had any auxiliary or external tanks, we could use the aux 1 or 2 setting. But there are none loaded onto the helicopter on this flight, so they show 0. And I like to keep it on the total setting, just gives me a correct reminder of how the fuel consumption is looking. And just as a small hint, the fuel consumption of the helicopter is between 700 and 1000 liters per hour, depending on if you're in a hover or you're cruising or stuff like that. So right now I expect about 1 more hour of flight time remaining before we're probably quite low on fuel. And yeah, this concludes this very first video on the Mi-24P. I hope you learned something, and leave a comment if you have any questions or anything like that. And in the next videos we will focus on weapon employment. We'll start off with the anti-tank guided missiles using the Petrovich AI, and then we also will focus on guns, rockets and all the other fun stuff to play with. So yeah, thank you for watching, have a very great day and a nice flight.